It was supposed to be just another ordinary morning on the family estate I had called home for 25 years. The sun was rising over the rolling hills of our quiet suburban enclave, casting a golden glow across the perfectly manicured lawns that stretched for acres. This wasn't just any property, it was a living piece of history passed down through 4 generations of my family. At the far end of the 10-acre plot, tucked beneath ancient oak trees that had stood for over a century, lay our private family cemetery. 15 graves, each one carefully tended, each one holding the remains and memories of grandparents, parents, aunts, uncles, and cousins who had built everything I now protected. I had promised them I would keep this land sacred, a final resting place untouched by the chaos of the modern world. But as I stepped onto the back porch with my coffee in hand, the peace shattered like glass. The distant rumble of heavy machinery grew louder, and the air carried the sharp scent of diesel fuel and freshly churned dirt. My stomach twisted as I walked toward the fence line that separated my land from the newer developments. What I saw stopped me cold. The entire family cemetery had been razed. Headstones lay toppled and cracked like discarded toys. Deep gouges scarred the earth where bulldozers had plowed straight through the graves. 15 sacred sites gone in a single night of ruthless destruction. Soil that had held my family's history was now piled in careless mounds, exposed and violated. In the middle of the devastation stood the HOA board members, clipboards in hand, gesturing at blueprints as if they owned the world. Their community expansion project, a brand new clubhouse, pool, and recreational area, was clearly underway, and they had chosen my family cemetery as the perfect spot to make it happen. They had ignored every legal boundary, every warning letter I had sent, every polite refusal. This wasn't an accident. This was deliberate. The HOA, led by the same entitled group that had fined me for aesthetic violations like planting heirloom flowers or keeping my historic fence, had finally crossed the line into pure evil. My hands shook with a rage I had never felt before. This wasn't just property damage. This was desecration of the deepest kind. They thought they could bulldoze my legacy and get away with it because they held the power in this neighborhood. They thought the little guy would roll over and accept their greater good excuse. But standing there amid the wreckage of my family's final resting place, I made a silent vow that would change everything. I would document every inch of this crime. I would fight them with every resource I had. I would make the entire HOA regret the day they ever set foot on my land. The destruction they caused would pale in comparison to the regret I was about to hand them. The battle had just begun, and I was ready to win it, no matter how long or how ugly it got. Chapter 1: The Legacy They Tried to Erase. I had always known the family estate was more than bricks and mortar. It was the culmination of over 100 years of hard work, sacrifice, and love from people whose blood ran in my veins. When my grandfather passed the deed to me 25 years ago, he made me swear on the family Bible that I would protect every inch of it, especially the quiet corner where 15 generations rested in peace. The property sat on 10 beautifully landscaped acres in a once peaceful suburban neighborhood that had slowly been swallowed by new housing developments. Those new homes brought with them the dreaded HOA, a group of self-appointed rulers who believed their rules superseded everything, including common decency and actual law. For years I had dealt with their petty harassment. They fined me for the color of my heirloom rose bushes because they didn't match the approved palette. They sent notices about my historic wooden fence being non-compliant with modern standards. They even tried to force me to remove the old oak trees shading the cemetery because they supposedly blocked the view from the new community pathway. I fought every battle quietly, paying the ridiculous fines when I had to and ignoring the rest. I thought that was the worst it could get. I was wrong. The first real warning came in the form of a certified letter delivered on a crisp autumn afternoon. The HOA board had approved an expansion project for the community center. They wanted to add a grand clubhouse, an Olympic-sized pool, and extensive recreational grounds. The only problem was that their blueprints showed the new facilities overlapping onto my land by nearly 2 acres, right through the heart of the family cemetery. I immediately hired a land surveyor and a lawyer to respond. The evidence was ironclad. The property line had been surveyed and recorded decades before the HOA even existed. My lawyer sent a strongly worded rebuttal explaining that any encroachment would be met with immediate legal action. The board responded with silence for weeks, then with thinly veiled threats. They claimed an old easement clause from the original development plan gave them rights, even though my title search proved otherwise. Neighbors whispered that the president of the HOA had personal financial stakes in the construction company chosen for the job. I attended the next open board meeting, where they smiled politely while dismissing my concerns as overly emotional. I could feel the entitlement radiating from them. They truly believed they could take what they wanted because the community needed it more than my dead relatives needed their final resting place. As winter approached, the tension thickened. I installed security cameras around the cemetery perimeter and began documenting every interaction. I spent long evenings walking the property, touching the weathered headstones, and remembering stories my father had told me about each person buried there. The graves were not just markers, they were anchors to my identity. The HOA's expansion dreams felt like a direct attack on my soul. I lay awake at night imagining the worst, but even then I never expected them to act so brazenly. The property looked as pristine as ever under the winter stars, the oaks standing tall like silent guardians. I told myself I had done everything right. I had the law on my side. But the HOA operated on a different set of rules written by greed and power. Little did I know, while I was preparing my next legal response, they were already planning the ultimate violation under the cover of darkness. The real nightmare was only hours away, and when it arrived, it would shatter the last illusion of peace I had left on this sacred land. Chapter 2. The Night They Crossed the Line. The destruction happened under a moonless sky in the dead of winter. I woke to the low growl of heavy equipment around 3 in the morning, but by the time I pulled on clothes and reached the back fence, the damage was already catastrophic. The security cameras I had installed captured everything in chilling detail. 3 bulldozers, a backhoe, and a crew of workers directed by none other than the HOA board president herself. They had cut through the fence line with bolt cutters, driven straight onto my property, and begun leveling the cemetery without a single permit or notice. Headstones were shoved aside like rubble. The earth that had held my family for generations was scooped up and dumped into waiting trucks. 15 graves, reduced to nothing but torn sod and exposed soil in under 2 hours. I stood at the edge of the devastation as the first light of dawn revealed the full horror. My legs felt weak. The air smelled of diesel and freshly turned clay. The once peaceful cemetery now looked like a war zone. I immediately called the police and my lawyer. Within the hour, officers arrived, but the HOA crew had already packed up and left, leaving behind only tire tracks and destruction. The board president was waiting at the community center when the police went to question her. She claimed it was all a misunderstanding and that their surveyors had made an honest mistake about the property line. The police took statements but said it looked like a civil matter rather than criminal. I knew better. This was premeditated. I spent the entire day walking the ruined site with my lawyer and a forensic surveyor. We photographed every inch, collected soil samples, and documented the clear trespass. The HOA sent a letter that same afternoon stating they would compensate me for any inconvenience and proceed with their project once the error was corrected. The audacity made my blood boil. I refused every offer and filed an emergency injunction to halt all work. By evening, local news crews had picked up the story after I posted drone footage of the destroyed graves online. Neighbors who had once sided with the HOA began to question the board's actions. That night, I sat on my porch, staring at the empty spot where my grandparents' graves had been. The property felt violated in a way no words could describe. The HOA had not just destroyed headstones, they had tried to erase my family's history to make room for a swimming pool. I replayed the camera footage over and over, memorizing the faces of every person involved. My lawyer assured me we had a slam-dunk case for trespass, property damage, and emotional distress. But I wanted more than money. I wanted accountability. I wanted the entire board to feel the same helplessness they had inflicted on me. The next morning brought another certified letter demanding I allow their crews back onto the land for remediation. I tore it up and sent my own response through my attorney, a multi-million-dollar lawsuit and a demand for criminal investigation. The war had officially begun. The HOA thought they could bury the evidence along with my family's remains, but they had no idea how thoroughly I would dig up their secrets in return. The property that had once been my sanctuary now stood as a battlefield, and I was ready to fight until the very last acre was restored and every responsible party was held to account. As the sun set over the scarred landscape, I knew the HOA's biggest mistake wasn't the bulldozers. It was underestimating the man whose legacy they had just tried to destroy. The real reckoning was only beginning. Chapter 3. The fight goes public. With the cemetery in ruins, I threw every resource into the battle. My lawyer filed the lawsuit the very next week, seeking damages for trespass, desecration of graves, emotional distress, and punitive penalties that would make the HOA think twice about ever repeating such an act. I also contacted every local news station and even national outlets that covered HOA horror stories. Within days, the story exploded online. My drone footage of the destroyed graves went viral, racking up millions of views. People from across the country sent messages of support, sharing their own tales of HOA tyranny. The pressure on the board became unbearable. I spent the entire day walking the ruined site with my lawyer and a forensic surveyor. We photographed every inch, collected soil samples, and documented the clear trespass. The HOA sent a letter that same afternoon stating they would compensate me for any inconvenience and proceed with their project once the error was corrected. The audacity made my blood boil. I refused every offer and filed an emergency injunction to halt all work. By evening, local news crews had picked up the story after I posted drone footage of the destroyed graves online. Neighbors who had once sided with the HOA began to question the board's actions. That night, I sat on my porch, staring at the empty spot where my grandparents' graves had been. The property felt violated in a way no words could describe. The HOA had not just destroyed headstones, they had tried to erase my family's history to make room for a swimming pool. I replayed the camera footage over and over, memorizing the faces of every person involved. My lawyer assured me we had a slam-dunk case for trespass, property damage, and emotional distress. But I wanted more than money. I wanted accountability. I wanted the entire board to feel the same helplessness they had inflicted on me. The next morning brought another certified letter demanding I allow their crews back onto the land for remediation. I tore it up and sent my own response through my attorney, a multi-million-dollar lawsuit and a demand for criminal investigation. The war had officially begun. The HOA thought they could bury the evidence along with my family's remains, but they had no idea how thoroughly I would dig up their secrets in return. The property that had once been my sanctuary now stood as a battlefield, and I was ready to fight until the very last acre was restored and every responsible party was held to account. As the sun set over the scarred landscape, I knew the HOA's biggest mistake wasn't the bulldozers. It was underestimating the man whose legacy they had just tried to destroy. The real reckoning was only beginning. Chapter 3. The fight goes public. With the cemetery in ruins, I threw every resource into the battle. My lawyer filed the lawsuit the very next week, seeking damages for trespass, desecration of graves, emotional distress, and punitive penalties that would make the HOA think twice about ever repeating such an act. I also contacted every local news station and even national outlets that covered HOA horror stories. Within days, the story exploded online. My drone footage of the destroyed graves went viral, racking up millions of views. People from across the country sent messages of support, sharing their own tales of HOA tyranny. The pressure on the board became unbearable. The HOA responded by doubling down. They issued a public statement calling me unreasonable and claiming the expansion was vital for property values. They even tried to fine me again for creating a public nuisance with the media attention. I laughed when the notice arrived. My lawyer countered with a motion to hold the entire board in contempt. Meanwhile, I hired a private investigator to look into the board members' backgrounds. What he found was gold. The president had financial ties to the construction company, and 2 other members had been involved in similar shady land deals in neighboring towns. Neighbors who had previously stayed silent began to speak out. Several families told me they had been threatened with fines if they supported me. I organized a neighborhood meeting on my own property, away from HOA control. Dozens showed up, many expressing outrage at the grave desecration. The tide was turning. Media interviews followed, where I calmly laid out the facts while standing in front of the ruined sacred space. The visuals were powerful, pristine lawns surrounding a torn-up sacred space. Public opinion shifted hard against the HOA. The board tried to settle quietly, offering a pathetic sum and a promise to restore the graves eventually. I rejected every offer. I wanted them in court. I wanted a judge to see the evidence and hear how they had prioritized human dignity over a pool. My lawyer prepared expert witnesses, historians on the cultural importance of family cemeteries, surveyors proving the illegal encroachment, and even a psychologist to testify on the emotional trauma. The discovery process revealed emails where board members joked about taking care of the cemetery problem before the bulldozers rolled in. The evidence was damning. Through it all, I continued tending what remained of the site, placing temporary markers and planting flowers where headstones once stood. The property still felt like home, but it was a wounded home. Every time I looked at the damage, I felt a fresh wave of determination. The HOA had awakened a side of me I never knew existed, a relentless fighter who would not stop until justice was served. Legal bills were mounting, but supporters had started a fundraiser that covered most of them. The story was no longer just about my land. It had become a symbol for anyone who had ever been bullied by an out-of-control HOA. The court date was set for early spring. As I reviewed the final briefs with my lawyer, I could sense the board members growing nervous. Their public statements became more defensive. Their private communications, leaked by whistleblowers, showed panic. They had destroyed 15 graves thinking no one would care. Now the whole world was watching, and I was just getting started. The courtroom battle would decide everything, and I was ready to walk in with my head held high and my evidence ironclad. But even as the legal machine turned in my favor, I knew the HOA still had one last desperate card to play. The real fireworks were yet to come. Chapter 4. Digging up their secrets. Spring arrived with blooming flowers that contrasted sharply with the bare earth of the cemetery. While the lawsuit moved forward, I focused on exposing the rot inside the HOA. My private investigator delivered a thick file that painted a damning picture. The board president had funneled thousands of community dues into her personal accounts through fake vendor contracts. 2 other members had hidden past bankruptcies and foreclosure scandals. The construction company they hired for the expansion was owned by the president's cousin. Every piece fit together like a corrupt puzzle. I leaked the findings to the same journalists who had covered the grave destruction. The headlines were brutal. HOA corruption exposed after grave desecration. Community outrage reached a fever pitch. Residents demanded an audit of the HOA books. Several board members resigned under pressure, but the core group dug in deeper. They tried to sue me for defamation, but my lawyer crushed the attempt with truth as a defense. The more they attacked, the stronger my position became. I also rallied the neighbors into a formal petition to dissolve the HOA entirely. Over 70% of homeowners signed it. We held peaceful protests outside the community center, carrying signs that read, "Respect the dead and no more HOA tyranny." The media loved the visuals, especially drone shots of the ruined cemetery next to the half-built clubhouse. Public donations poured in to help restore the graves once the lawsuit was won. I used part of the funds to hire a team of archaeologists and restoration experts to carefully document and preserve any remains that could be recovered. The HOA's lawyers tried every delay tactic in the book: requests for extensions, motions to dismiss, even claims that my family cemetery was a public hazard. Each one was denied. In deposition after deposition, board members squirmed when confronted with their own emails and financial records. I sat through every session, watching their confidence crumble. The property itself began to feel like a symbol of resistance. I kept it immaculate except for the grave scar, which I left untouched as evidence. By late spring, the pressure was unbearable for the HOA. Their insurance company started hinting at dropping coverage. Property values in the neighborhood actually dropped because of the negative publicity. The very expansion project they had destroyed my graves for was now stalled indefinitely. I received anonymous letters and calls begging me to drop the suit, but I ignored them all. This fight had become about more than just my land. It was about holding power accountable. The court finally scheduled the full trial for summer. My lawyer and I spent weeks preparing. We rehearsed every detail, making sure the judge would see not just the facts, but the human cost. I visited the cemetery daily, talking to my ancestors in my mind, promising them the justice they deserved. The estate still stood proud, its lawns green and the house welcoming, but the missing graves were a constant reminder of what had been taken. The HOA had spent years bullying residents into submission. Now they were the ones on the defensive, and I was the one holding all the cards. Their secrets were out in the open, and the consequences were about to hit them like a freight train. The trial would be the final chapter in their reign of entitlement, and I intended to make sure it ended in total defeat.